Imagine standing in line at a coffee shop waiting for your turn. The barista hands the wrong order to the person in front of you. They fix it quickly, and there is no major issue. You step up, place your order, and go to a table to wait for your drink. And then suddenly your mind begins to wander. You start imagining an argument you had last week with a coworker or a friend. Except, in this version you are imagining right now, you have the exact right words. Words that were not spoken at the time. The words you just remembered are sharp and devastating in the best possible way. You win, clearly and completely, because the imaginary version of your coworker has no response. The imaginary version of you is composed, confident, well-argued, simply victorious. Have you ever experienced such an event? Suddenly the waiter interrupts your train of thought, brings you your coffee, and you realize that you have spent the last few minutes completely somewhere else, inside a scenario that never happened and probably never will. And you feel sorry about it. Am I right? By the way, this is not an unusual experience. In fact, it is deeply human. Most people at some point have found themselves rehearsing arguments that are already over, imagining conversations that might never happen, reliving moments from years ago, and rewriting their endings. We do it in line, in the shower, during long drives, in that quiet space between falling asleep and actual sleep. We do it constantly. The worst part is that the situation upsets you all over again, and you regret not remembering to say those things to that person at the time. Let's look at this from a scientific perspective to see what actually happens when we do this. Why do our minds create these imaginary theaters in our heads? What does this reveal about the nature of our identity, memory, emotions, and needs? And is it something we should worry about, or something we should understand as an integral part of our lives? Psychologists have long been interested in the mind's tendency to wander from the present, completely out of the blue, where our gaze drifts into the distance and we are suddenly far away while physically still present. Has this ever happened to you, or have you ever noticed it in your relatives or friends? In a landmark study, psychologists Matthew Killingsworth and Daniel Gilbert found that about 47% of people's waking thoughts do not relate to what is currently happening around them. In other words, we spend almost half of our conscious existence somewhere other than where we actually are. If you didn't know, they observed this and called it a cognitive achievement, but one that comes with an emotional cost. Their research showed that a wandering mind is reliably associated with lower levels of momentary happiness, regardless of the activity the person was engaged in. Yet, within that broad category of mind wandering, there is a specific and particularly vivid type of mental activity, constructing complex imagined scenarios in your head. This is not mere idle daydreaming, but something more intentional, more charged. It is a mentally rehearsed confrontation, or simply put, facing off against an opposing side, or even simpler, a fantasy of recognition or revenge. Imagined future conversations where everything goes perfectly, a relived event from the past. These are not random fragments of thought, but entire, constructed narratives, complete with dialogues, environments, emotional stakes, and outcomes. This type of thinking even goes so deep that it's not just the two of you in that duel. You have created a broader picture and imagined the environment around you. What do you think about that? It seems a bit funny, but also a bit scary when I talk about it. This phenomenon has been given various names in psychological literature. Mental simulation, a widely used term that broadly refers to the mind's capacity to generate internal representations of scenarios that are not currently real. Maladaptive daydreaming, a more colloquial framework used by some researchers and therapists when it becomes excessive, a state where the internal world of fantasy begins to compete with or replace the external world. But to simplify, the more common version of this, the version most people experience occasionally, is simply a feature of how the human mind processes experiences, emotions, and identity. I am going to guess right now that while watching this video, you have thought of at least one scenario you invented in the past. Am I right? Let's take a look at why we do this. This helps us understand what the brain is fundamentally trying to do when it engages in this type of simulation. The brain is not a passive recording device. It does not simply receive information from the world and store it neutrally to be locked away in a chest. It is a prediction machine, a system that constantly generates models of reality, updates them based on new information, and uses them to predict what comes next. As described by neuroscientist and philosopher Antonio Damasio, the brain builds and constantly rebuilds a continuous model of itself and its environment, moment by moment. This model is not fixed. It is dynamic, narrative, and, most importantly, future-oriented. From this perspective, imagining fake scenarios is not an impairment of the mind, but an extension of one of its primary functions. When we rehearse an argument we haven't had yet, we are running a simulation, testing outcomes, preparing responses, bracing for threats, and devising outcomes that might await us and how to react to them. When we replay a conversation that already happened but rewrite our role in it, we are doing something functionally similar, processing an emotionally unresolved event, testing alternative outcomes, and searching for the version of events that restores a sense of competence or dignity. This is why these imagined scenarios are almost never emotionally neutral. These thoughts stem from places where we feel we failed, where we were misunderstood, where we lost something, or where we still fear losing something because we simply couldn't think of the right response at the time. The brain goes back to those places not for some irrelevant reason, but out of a need to resolve them, to close the loop that has been bothering you deep down because it might have hurt you. One of the explanations for understanding this comes from psychoanalytic thought, especially the work of Sigmund Freud and later Carl Jung. For Freud, the mind was constantly engaged in negotiations between what is consciously acknowledged and what is repressed, what we can face and what we cannot. Fantasy, in his view, was a space where unconscious desires and unresolved psychic tensions could be expressed in a disguised or symbolic form. The imagined scenario is not random. It is directed. It strives towards something the person needs but could not access through direct experience. What we didn't remember at that moment, or maybe we did but didn't have the courage to say, "Am I right?" Have you ever been in a situation like this? Jung further expanded his psychology on this topic. For Jung, the stories the psyche constructs in dreams, in fantasies, in what he called active imagination, were communications from deeper layers of the personality. They were the psyche's attempts to speak through symbols and narratives about what it needed in order to integrate the recurring imaginary argument, the fantasy of recognition, the rehearsed goodbye. These were not mere self-indulgences, but invitations. Invitations to look at what our self is still trying to grapple with. That self where we want to keep our dignity because we might have lost it at that moment. In this light, a person who repeatedly imagines a situation with someone who wronged them is not simply petty or obsessive. They may be in the early stages of something that, if examined carefully, could become a genuine insight. The scenario is a symptom, yes, but symptoms in the clinical sense are not enemies. They are signals trying to help us resolve certain things that remain inside us and may be troubling us. Human beings are deeply social creatures, wouldn't you agree? Our sense of self is not developed or maintained in isolation. It is constructed in relation to others through interaction, recognition, conflict, care, and love. As philosopher Charles Taylor wrote, "Identity is always dialogical. We become who we are partly through the conversations we have, real or imagined, with the people who matter to us, from parents to friends. When something goes wrong in one of those social interactions, when we are rejected, misunderstood, publicly shamed, or treated unfairly, it is not only registered as an unpleasant event, but also reflects on our mental and internal state. The brain does not take these experiences lightly. Research by renowned scientist Naomi Eisenberger showed that the pain of social rejection activates many of the same neural regions involved in physical and psychological pain. Being excluded, humiliated, ignored by someone whose validation we sought, but did not receive. Such experiences hurt, you know. Because of such feelings, people often seek the opinions of their parents, relatives, friends, and psychologists, because it affected them and caused them mental anguish. Am I right? I don't know if you've ever felt this or a similar situation. And so the imagined scenario becomes a kind of remedy, the answer we didn't have at the time, or didn't want to say because we were ashamed or didn't want to hurt the other person, even though they hurt us. In our mind, the one who was dismissed in a meeting gets the chance to be the sharpest voice in the room. The person who was left without an apology gets the chance to hear it completely and finally. The person who was silenced gets to speak. These are compensations, repairs that the outside world has not yet provided, and which the internal world tries to make up for. This is part of the reason why imaginary victories feel so deeply satisfying in the moment. The brain does not make a perfect distinction between a vividly imagined experience and a real one. The same emotional reward systems are activated. The feeling of resolution is not entirely fake. It is real, at least as far as the feeling goes, even if the events that triggered it never took place. But here is where things become truly complicated. The relief provided by imagined scenarios is, in most cases, temporary, making us feel better in that moment. At least I hope so. The core emotional need, the need for recognition, fairness, resolution, is not actually met. The real conversation never even happened. The real outcome hasn't changed. And so the mind returns again and again to that same imaginary theater, replaying the same scenarios, because the emotional hunger that created them is still unsated. Mind you, scenes like this can appear just once, while for some, they can last for months or even years. Do you agree? This is the mechanism by which ordinary imaginative processing can transition into something less adaptive. When the imagined scenario becomes a substitute for real engagement rather than a rehearsal for it. When it becomes a place to live rather than a place to prepare, it can start to close off rather than open up a person's relationship with their actual life. Renowned psychologist Elaine Hatfield and her colleagues have done extensive work on what they call emotional co-regulation, the process by which people manage difficult emotional states through actual interactions with others. One of the conclusions drawn from this research is that imagined interactions, no matter how satisfying they are in the moment, do not provide what real interactions provide. Genuine attunement, the unpredictability of the other person, the experience of truly being heard. The imaginary interlocutor is, by definition, fully under the control of the person imagining them. They can be made to say exactly what is needed so that you have the right response and emerge as the winner. But here is where things become truly complicated. The relief provided by imagined scenarios is, in most cases, temporary, making us feel better in that moment. At least I hope so. The core emotional need, the need for recognition, fairness, resolution, is not actually met. The real conversation never even happened. The real outcome hasn't changed. And so the mind returns, again and again, to that same imaginary theater, replaying the same scenarios, because the emotional hunger that created them is still unsated. Mind you, scenes like this can appear just once, while for some, they can last for months or even years. Do you agree? This is the mechanism by which ordinary imaginative processing can transition into something less adaptive. When the imagined scenario becomes a substitute for real engagement rather than a rehearsal for it, when it becomes a place to live rather than a place to prepare, it can start to close off rather than open up a person's relationship with their actual life. Renowned psychologist Elaine Hatfield and her colleagues have done extensive work on what they call emotional co-regulation, the process by which people manage difficult emotional states through actual interactions with others. One of the conclusions drawn from this research is that imagined interactions, no matter how satisfying they are in the moment, do not provide what real interactions provide. Genuine attunement, the unpredictability of the other person, the experience of truly being heard. The imaginary interlocutor is, by definition, fully under the control of the person imagining them. They can be made to say exactly what is needed so that you have the right response and emerge as the winner. When imagined scenarios are used as a form of preparation, when the rehearsed conversation eventually becomes real, when the processed emotion eventually leads to a real conversation with the actual person, When the replayed event eventually becomes a source of genuine understanding of what mattered and why, then they have served their proper function. They then acted as a bridge from a difficult emotional experience to something more integrated. However, when they become an end in themselves, when the mental theater becomes more appealing than the messiness and uncertainty of real life, when imaginary victory starts to replace real relationships, then they become something closer to what psychologists call avoidance. Not a bridge, but a detour. Writing over a century ago, the famous psychologist William James noted that attention is the most fundamental form of choice available to human beings. What we choose to pay attention to is, in a very real sense, what we choose to be. Our experience is not simply given to us by the world. It is, at least in part, constructed by what we agree to pay attention to, what we dwell on, and what we return to. The imagined scenarios we construct are, from this angle, expressions of what the mind pays attention to, and therefore expressions of what our self is, or is trying to become, in that moment. They reveal the emotional landscape, what feels runs evolved, what feels threatened, what is needed. They are not random, they are a map, the mind's capacity to construct other worlds, other versions of events, other possibilities, is not a flaw. It is, in fact, one of the most distinctly human traits we possess. But, like many distinctly human things, its value depends entirely on how we handle it. If we hold it too loosely, it is just aimless wandering, a pleasant waste of time. If we hold it too tightly, it becomes a substitute for the very experiences it was supposed to help us process. Perhaps the most honest use of the imaginary is not to replace the real, but to clarify it, not to rehearse an untouchable version of ourselves, but to discover the version that is still afraid to exist. The coffee is ready. The argument in your mind concludes. The other person, as always, has no response. You take a sip, put the cup down, and return to where you actually are. And maybe this time you notice something about that imagined exchange, something about what you still need, what you are still struggling with, and you decide to do something about it. Really, that, perhaps, is what that mental theater has been hoping for all along. One thing that becomes clear when we think about the nature of our inner life is how important it is to have a place where we can bring ideas into reality, not just to rehearse them endlessly in our minds, but to actually place them somewhere in the real world. So, if you have been rehearsing this conversation with yourself for a long time, don't keep it inside. Bring it out, get it off your chest, and lighten your soul and mind. See you in the next video.